You are sitting in a meeting, right? And you're staring at this massive, just undeniable problem.
Oh, the elephant in the room.
Exactly. It's this glaring systemic failure, and it's unfolding right in front of you. And here is the terrifying psychological paradox about that exact moment.
Let me guess. The bystander effect.
You nailed it. The more people in that room who see the problem, the less likely it is that, anyone will actually step up to fix it. I mean, we have all experienced this.
Oh, yeah. Or every single one of us.
Right. You are part of a team or a neighborhood coalition or maybe a church committee. And there's this metaphorical burst pipe just flooding the hallway. The water is rising. It is soaking everyone's shoes. And literally everyone agrees the water is a problem.
They're probably all standing around the coffee machine complaining at the damp carpet, right?
Yes. But absolutely no one moves to shut off the valve. We just stare at the rising water, paralyzed, secretly waiting for anyone with a clipboard or an official title or specialized permission to just, walk in and grab a wrench.
And that collective paralysis is, well, it's a heavily documented phenomenon. It's usually related to that diffusion of responsibility we just mentioned.
Right.
We naturally assume that because a failure is so highly visible, the system must already be aware of it. So, therefore, someone else is assigned to handle it.
Like it's above my pay grade. Right.
Exactly. We convince ourselves that taking action would be stepping on toes or violating some unspoken hierarchy. So human communities, they simply adapt to the flood.
Yeah.
They learn to swim in the dysfunction rather than, actually fixing the plumbing.
Which is wild. So welcome to the deep dive. Today we are dismantling that exact paralysis and uncovering the specific mechanics of how to break it.
That's going to be a good one.
Okay, let's unpack this. The insights we are looking at today come from a really comprehensive manuscript titled Initiative, Mission, and Missional Burden. And just to set the parameters for you listening, this is a singular, extensive document, and it's aimed primarily at Christian ministry leaders.
Right. It leans pretty heavily on biblical frameworks and theological history.
It does. But our mission today is to extract the core thesis here, because the psychological and organizational truths embedded in this text, they're universal.
Oh, absolutely.
We are decoding why some groups, whether that is a corporate department, a volunteer organization, a startup, or even just a family, why some of them truly transform the people within them, while others, merely survive on life support.
Yeah, and the foundational argument here is that the dividing line between stagnation and transformation, it is not resource allocation.
You're not the budget.
No, not the budget. It is not raw talent, and it is not even historical prestige. The dividing line is initiative. But the concept of initiative is often just grossly misunderstood.
Yeah, how so?
Well, it is usually treated as a personality trait, right? The domain of the loud, the extroverted, the highly assertive people.
Alpha types.
Exactly. But this source completely dismantles that idea. It reframes initiative as a deeply spiritual and psychological reflex that actually must be cultivated.
I love that. So we are going to explore the hidden dangers of reactive leadership, the sharp distinction between holding a passing sympathy for an issue versus carrying a true missional burden, and the mechanics of how the simple, courageous act of moving first rewires the entire neurological culture of a community.
It's a huge shift in perspective.
It really is. So let's start by defining the baseline. To understand what the anatomy of initiative even is, we have to forensically examine its opposite, which the manuscript identifies as the default state of human institutions, and that is reactivity.
Reactivity.
Yeah.
The text paints this really visceral picture of what a reactive culture looks like. It describes a leadership style that basically waits until a wound is openly festering before reaching for the bandages.
Wow. Festering.
Yeah, it waits until a household is in absolute disarray
Yeah.
before attempting to establish any order. You wait until the sheep have already wandered off the cliff before you start wondering about building a fence.
It's so defensive.
It is, and this creates a deeply entrenched, what they call a maintenance organization, where all available energy, capital, and emotional bandwidth is spent desperately patching leaks.
What's fascinating here is how that patching process creates a secondary, far more dangerous cultural disease.
Right, the normalized dysfunction.
Yes, normalized dysfunction.
Yeah.
Unpack that for us, because the psychology there is just wild.
Well, habituation is a really powerful force. When a community is constantly exposed to a low-level chronic deficit, whether that is structural neglect, relational isolation, or a lack of spiritual vitality, they eventually just go numb to it.
The brain literally stops hearing the alarm.
Exactly. The brain physically stops processing the background noise. Problems in communities, they rarely start as raging infernos. They start as quiet absences.
Give me an example of what that looks like on the ground.
Sure. It is the first-time guest who visits, slips out the back door, and is never contacted. It is the single mother who slowly stops attending over a period of months, and her absence triggers absolutely no systemic inquiry.
Oh, I see this in the corporate world all the time. It is the employee who used to be highly engaged, right? But they slowly stop speaking up in meetings, and management they just accept the silence as their new personality.
Precisely. Because these people fade away quietly, because their slow disengagement does not sound a loud, immediate, catastrophic alarm, the community simply adapts to the vacuum they leave behind.
It just becomes normal.
Yeah, the dysfunction becomes the new baseline. The threshold for what constitutes a healthy community lowers imperceptibly, day by day, until the absence of health feels entirely normal.
Man, that's heavy.
And reactive leaders walk right past these quiet, smoldering embers because their eyes are exclusively trained to look for blazing fires.
Okay, I want to introduce a metaphor here to make this incredibly concrete for you listening, because we often glorify the reactive leader without even realizing it.
We really do.
Think about the difference between a hospital triage ward and a preventative medicine clinic. In a triage ward, the doctors and nurses are absolute heroes.
Oh, no question.
They are dealing with gunshot wounds, cardiac arrests, critical trauma. They save lives in the moment of ultimate crisis. Everyone respects the ER doctor. But if a town only has an emergency room, and zero preventative care, zero pediatricians, zero nutritionists, that town is failing.
The whole system is broken.
Right. The building is constantly full of people who are dying of things that could have been caught 5 years earlier. The heroics of the ER actually mask the systemic failure of the town's health network.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize the danger of the maintenance organization. You spend all your time celebrating the dramatic rescues while completely ignoring the systemic failures that made the rescues necessary in the first place.
But let me challenge this paradigm on behalf of the listener. Let's push back on the idea that chronic urgency is a bad thing. Isn't dealing with emergencies the literal definition of sacrifice and duty?
It feels like it, right?
Yeah. If you are a pastor, a community leader, or a manager, and someone is in the hospital, or a family is falling apart, or a project is imploding at 2:00 a.m., you drop everything and you go into the fire. That is the job. How can the manuscript criticize leaders for responding to the deepest points of human pain?
What's fascinating here is the distinction the text makes, and it's subtle but absolute. Showing up in a crisis is undeniably a facet of faithful leadership. Sacrifice is a requirement.
Okay.
However, chronic reactivity is not the same thing as faithful responsiveness. If a leader or a leadership structure is only ever reacting to emergencies, they are inadvertently engineering an environment that depends on crisis. They are building a perverse incentive structure.
Wait, a perverse incentive structure. Unpack the mechanics of that. How does reacting to a crisis incentivize more crisis?
Think about what you are teaching the community regarding how to secure resources and attention.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. If the only time an individual receives pastoral care, leadership intervention, or organizational support is when their situation has completely detonated, you are training them to wait for the detonation.
Wow.
You teach the congregation or the workforce that a quiet struggle will be ignored. A reactive culture effectively broadcasts the message, do not ask for help until the pain is undeniably catastrophic, because we do not have the bandwidth for anything less than a 4-alarm fire.
That is a devastating indictment. No one will notice you until you become a problem. We see this everywhere.
Everywhere.
In the corporate world, the squeaky wheel gets the promotion or the resources, while the quiet, diligent worker who is slowly burning out under an impossible workload gets entirely ignored. And they're ignored until the day they drop their resignation letter on the desk.
And then what happens?
Suddenly there's a counteroffer, sudden panic, sudden attention, but it is way too late.
Exactly. And that is why the source defines true shepherding or true leadership as anticipatory care. It is an active posture, not a passive one. Anticipatory leaders do not wait for the formal invitation of a crisis.
They move first.
Right. The text uses the historical and theological model of Jesus to illustrate this holy attentiveness. It notes a profound pattern in his ministry. Jesus does not wait for individuals to become perfectly articulate in their need before he moves toward them.
Right. He sees it before they even say it.
He anticipates the hunger of the massive crowd before they complain. He perceives the social isolation of the leper. He notices the woman who has been systematically overlooked by the entire social structure around her. His leadership is marked by a refusal to wait for the situation to become unavoidable.
He moves into the friction before it becomes an explosion. So if we accept that waiting for the fire to break out is a cultural trap, we have to look at the catalyst. What is the actual sustainable motivation for stepping into that friction early?
Because it's exhausting, right?
It is, and this brings us to a major pivot point in the manuscript, and a concept that fundamentally redefines how we process empathy. We need to dissect the profound difference between harboring sympathy for a problem and carrying a missional burden for a problem.
And we culturally conflate the two constantly. We assume that because we feel a pang of sadness, we are burdened. But sympathy is fundamentally an emotion of distance.
Distance.
Sympathy allows you to observe a systemic failure, a tragedy, or a struggling colleague from a safe, detached vantage point. You can look at the situation, acknowledge the pain, and say, that is incredibly unfortunate. I hope the designated authorities handle that.
Basically wiping your hands of it.
Yeah, sympathy allows you to sleep peacefully at night because the problem remains external to your identity.
I mean, sympathy is scrolling past a tragic news story, feeling genuinely bad for maybe 3 seconds, leaving a sad emoji, and then moving on to a cooking video. It requires zero caloric or emotional investment.
Exactly. Burden, however, is an entirely different psychological and spiritual mechanism. The text explains that a burden internalizes the need. It breaches the barrier of distance.
It's inside you.
When you have a missional burden, the problem essentially enters your own body. Burden looks at the exact same broken system and says, this must not remain unresolved, and I am implicated in its resolution. It is a sacred internal pressure that makes ongoing indifference impossible. You cannot unsee it.
The text calls this holy discomfort. That phrase stopped me. Holy discomfort.
It's powerful.
We are so conditioned, especially in modern spirituality or wellness culture, to view comfort, peace, and total lack of friction as the ultimate signs that we are aligned with the universe or aligned with God.
If it's easy, it must be meant to be.
Right. But the manuscript argues that sometimes the most divine thing you can experience is a heavy, agonizing conviction that actually destroys your peace. It makes your previous apathy feel like a physical weight.
It completely shatters the illusion that spiritual maturity equals tranquil detachment.
Yeah.
To illustrate the anatomy of a burden, the text spends significant time on the historical account of Nehemiah. And analyzing Nehemiah through a modern lens really reveals the staggering cost of a true burden.
Set the scene for us there. Geopolitically.
Geopolitically, Nehemiah is in a position of ultimate safety. He is the cupbearer to the king of the Persian Empire. He has a secure, highly compensated government job, entirely insulated from the chaos of the outside world.
He's made it.
He really has. But he receives a report that the walls of Jerusalem, his ancestral city, miles and miles away, are broken down, and the people are living in disgrace and vulnerability.
And his reaction is entirely counterintuitive to how a modern executive would handle bad news about a distant subsidiary. I mean, he doesn't open a spreadsheet. He doesn't delegate a task force to conduct a feasibility study on brick supply chains.
No, his first response is not strategic at all. It is visceral. The historical record shows that he collapsed, he wept, he mourned for days, he fasted, and he prayed.
It physically broke him.
The psychological toll of the burden broke his heart long before his mind ever engineered a blueprint to rebuild the walls. The manuscript emphasizes this sequence because it is a universal law of profound leadership: burden precedes building.
Burden precedes building. I like that.
A strategic vision that is never rooted in a visceral burden usually remains an abstract whiteboard exercise. It lacks the durability to survive opposition, but when a burden takes root, it acts as an internal summons. It follows you into your quiet moments, it dictates the questions you ask, and it completely ruins your ability to be satisfied with the status quo.
It ruins your satisfaction. That is the cost right there. But here is the massive practical problem for you listening and navigating the modern world. How do you distinguish between a genuine, productive burden, this holy discomfort, and just the baseline hum of modern anxiety?
Right, because we're all anxious.
Exactly, or the panic of an endless news cycle. We live in an era of infinite information where we are constantly bombarded with the tragedies of the entire globe. You feel tightness in your chest. You feel the urgency.
But is it a calling or just stress?
So, what does this all mean? How do you know if you are experiencing a missional burden meant for you to act on, or if you are simply suffering from cortisol overload and the pressure to look busy? Because physically, panic and burden can mimic each other perfectly.
That is perhaps the most crucial diagnostic question a modern leader can ask, and the text draws a brilliant hard boundary between the two states. It defines panic or anxiety as a fear-driven preoccupation with outcomes you cannot control.
Okay, fear-driven preoccupation.
Yes. Burden, on the other hand, is defined as a love-driven concern over what you cannot ignore.
Wow. I want to isolate that definition because it is the intellectual core of this entire concept. Panic is a fear-driven preoccupation with outcomes you cannot control. Burden is a love-driven concern over what you cannot ignore. The difference is the locus of the emotion, fear versus love.
Let's examine the mechanics of how those two emotions operate on the human soul. Anxiety fundamentally narrows your vision. It forces you into a defensive crouch.
You just want to survive.
Right. When you are panicking about an organizational failure or a societal issue, your mental energy is exhausted through a spiraling uncertainty about the future. You become obsessed with self-preservation, protecting your institution's reputation, or mitigating your own liability.
Covering your own bases.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But a missional burden operates entirely differently. It enlarges the soul. It actually generates energy by connecting you to a sense of sacred responsibility.
So if you are staring at a spreadsheet showing declining attendance or dropping sales, and you are panicking, you are looking at the numbers and thinking, how am I going to explain this to the board? Is my job safe? Are we going to go under? It is entirely self-referential.
Self-referential, yes.
But if you are burdened by that same spreadsheet, you aren't just seeing numbers. You are seeing the human faces behind the data. You are seeing the single mother who stopped coming. You are seeing the exhausted employees who are failing because the system is literally breaking them.
Exactly. Panic sees a threat to the self. Burden sees a threat to the other. And the manuscript is brutally clear that the burden cannot remain an internal emotional state.
Meaning you can't just cry about it.
Right? Tears are not a strategy. Empathy without action is just another form of self-indulgence. Nehemiah wept, but then he leveraged his position, risked his life by appearing sad before a volatile king, secured resources, and went to build a physical wall.
He actually did the thing.
He did. The text states that a burden only becomes a mission when it is translated into concrete physical movement. Prayer, if it never evolves into obedience, remains an incomplete circuit.
Which naturally introduces the massive theological and philosophical tension of the text. Because if you recognize the burden and you know you must act, what is the exact mechanism of that action?
This is where it gets tricky.
Yeah, how much of this is human willpower? And how much is divine providence or macro forces outside your control? In religious circles, and frankly in any philosophy dealing with fate versus free will, there is this massive friction. If you just grab the reins and start taking initiative, aren't you just acting out of arrogance? Aren't you relying on your own ego to fix the world?
To resolve that friction, the manuscript anchors its entire philosophy of initiative in a deeply theological paradigm, specifically citing Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13.
Okay, what does that say?
The passage says, "Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work." The text uses this ancient framework to construct a modern understanding of agency. Initiative, properly understood, is not self-reliance. It is not an ego trip. It is the physical manifestation of a surrendered heart.
Let's dissect that phrase. God works in you both to will and to work. So the argument is that God, or the divine spark, supplies both the initial desire, the burden itself, and the subsequent energetic capacity to execute the work. The human is not the originator. Human is the responder. God is the first mover in the cosmos.
Yes, the text points out that Christian theology begins entirely with divine initiative. The narrative is that before humanity ever sought restoration, God initiated the pursuit. The gospel itself is defined as God refusing to wait for ideal conditions to intervene in human history.
So we're mirroring that.
Exactly. Therefore, when a leader takes initiative, they are not inventing a new mission. They are participating in an ongoing, eternal one. They are not manufacturing a burden out of thin air. They are receiving a transmission.
This framing completely destroys the modern corporate myth of what a proactive leader looks like.
It really does.
We have this culturally ingrained archetype that to be a visionary, you have to be this relentless, type A, hyper-aggressive extrovert who stands on the table, shouts down the opposition, and bends reality to their will through sheer assertiveness.
The whole move fast and break things mentality.
Exactly. And I know countless brilliant people who sit in the back of the room analyzing problems with incredible clarity, but they never step up because they think, well, I am an introvert, I am contemplative, I don't have that dominant alpha energy, so I must not be a leader. But this text says that entire paradigm is a lie.
It is a toxic myth that sidelines millions of capable people. The manuscript argues that a deeply reserved, quiet person can be profoundly proactive, while a highly energetic, loud, constantly moving person can actually be spiritually and organizationally passive.
Wait, a constantly moving person can be passive.
Yeah, they might just be vibrating with anxious energy, creating noise without ever moving the needle on the actual mission.
Hmm.
In this framework, initiative is the fruit of deep spiritual formation. It grows out of the quiet disciplines, silence, listening, studying the text, and practicing humility.
It's an internal posture first.
Right. It matures when an individual stops asking, what will make me look good? Or what is the path of least resistance? And begins asking, what does faithfulness demand in this exact moment?
But let's test that theory against another cultural and theological staple, the concept of waiting. If you grew up in a religious tradition, you have had the phrase, wait on the Lord, drilled into your head.
Oh, constantly.
You wait for open doors. You wait for a sign. You wait for the right season. Even outside of religion, we are told to wait for market validation, wait for the data, wait for consensus. If a leader feels a burden and immediately leaps into action, aren't they violating that principle? Aren't they running ahead of the timing, risking total failure through impatience?
This raises an important question, and the manuscript anticipates this exact counterargument. It addresses it by forensically separating the concept of biblical waiting from human laziness.
Okay, because there is a difference.
A big difference.
Hmm.
The text completely affirms that there are seasons where waiting is the highest form of obedience. There are moments when silence is the only wisdom, and acting prematurely would be disastrous. However, it clarifies that true purposeful waiting is never defined by passive indifference. It is defined as active trust.
Active trust. You are preparing for the reality you are waiting for. You are packing your bags, checking the schedule, and standing on the platform while you wait for the train. You aren't asleep on a bench 3 miles away, hoping the train eventually comes to you.
Precisely. You are praying, discerning, gathering resources, and evaluating your own motives. But the text delivers a piercing warning regarding the expiration date of waiting.
It has an expiration date.
Yes. Waiting immediately morphs into disobedience the moment the mandate has been made clear. There comes a specific threshold where waiting is no longer about discerning timing. It is simply dressed-up hesitation. It is cowardice wearing a spiritual mask.
Dressed up hesitation. That is a brilliant articulation of how we rationalize our fear. We call it discernment. We call it gathering more data.
We love to gather data. A mature leader recognizes when the data gathering phase is over. They stop asking the heavens, who will come and fix this? And they start asking, what specific action does my faithfulness require today?
Because the need is already obvious.
Right. If the burden is heavy, if the societal or organizational need is visibly hemorrhaging, to continue waiting indefinitely for a booming voice from the sky or for a completely frictionless set of ideal conditions is a profound failure of stewardship. You are hoarding the agency you were given.
If you see someone drowning in a lake, you don't sit on the shore, close your eyes, and pray for a boat to arrive. The fact that you are standing on the shore, awake, with working lungs, is the mandate. The burden is the calling.
Exactly.
To ground this massive philosophical shift, the text pivots into historical case studies. It provides these ancient blueprints of what the first mover mentality actually looks like when it collides with real-world stakes.
And the manuscript is rich with these archetypes of leaders who refuse to wait for perfect conditions. Take the historical account of Joseph in Egypt.
Oh, that's a classic one.
He is thrust into a massive geopolitical crisis. He perceives, through prophetic insight, a coming agricultural famine that will devastate the region. He does not simply warn people and hope for the best.
He doesn't just write a think piece about it.
No, he initiates a massive, complex supply chain strategy, building silos and storing grain during the years of abundance. He didn't just survive the crisis, his anticipatory initiative preserved the lives of entire nations. He managed the disaster before the first crop ever failed.
Then you look at Esther, which highlights the absolute terror and cost of taking initiative. She is the queen. She is living in the palace, completely insulated from the immediate threat facing her people, who have been targeted for genocide.
She was the ultimate insider at that point.
She was. She could easily have rationalized staying silent. She could have claimed her influence was better used quietly behind the scenes later on. But her uncle reminds her of the reality: if you remain silent, deliverance will come from somewhere else, but you will perish.
So what does she do?
She takes the initiative to approach the volatile king uninvited. Her phrase is, "If I perish, I perish." It is the ultimate acknowledgement that taking the first move might result in your own destruction, but the cost of inaction is a moral failure you cannot live with.
The text also dissects the parable of the Good Samaritan, which operates as a devastating critique of passive religion.
Unpack that for us.
Well, the priest and the Levite, who walk past the beaten man on the road, represent the ultimate insiders. They possess theological knowledge, high social status, and undoubtedly a dozen highly sophisticated religious justifications for why they could not intervene, perhaps avoiding ritual impurity or rushing to perform temple duties.
Right, they had excuses that sounded very holy. And the text makes a crucial point here. The sin of the religious elite wasn't active malice. They didn't beat the man on the road. They didn't kick him while he was down. Their sin was omission.
Omission, yes.
They looked at the bleeding problem, analyzed it, and passed by on the other side. They maintained their purity by sacrificing their humanity. But the Samaritan, the cultural outsider, allowed his schedule to be violently interrupted by compassion. He applied the bandages, provided the transport, and funded the recovery. He proved that love is inherently kinetic. It requires movement.
But the most comprehensive organizational case study the manuscript offers is the early church in Antioch, found in the book of Acts, chapters 13 and 14.
Okay, let's talk about Antioch.
The text holds Antioch up as the gold standard of a community that not only expected divine direction, but fundamentally expected that obedience would require massive structural disruption.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because if you apply their decision-making process to a modern business school curriculum, it looks like absolute institutional suicide. Break down the psychology and the strategy of what the Antioch leaders actually did.
Well, we have to look at their baseline atmosphere. Antioch was not just going through the motions of maintaining a religious club. The text emphasizes their posture. They were actively worshiping, fasting, and listening.
They were dialed in.
They cultivated an environment of acute spiritual sensitivity. And into that primed atmosphere, the directive comes, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." The critical context here is that Barnabas and Saul were not middle management.
They weren't the B team.
They were not expendable volunteers. They were arguably the most gifted, culturally fluent, and valuable leaders the Antioch community possessed.
This is the part that completely shatters our modern organizational instincts. Antioch did not send away their B team to fulfill this new global mission. They didn't send the interns. They sent their absolute apex talent.
Which is crazy to think about today.
Imagine a highly successful tech startup in Silicon Valley. The culture is electric, the product is scaling, the revenue is doubling. And the board of directors suddenly decides to take their top 2 software architects, the absolute visionaries who built the core algorithm, and simply gives them away.
Just hands them over.
They send them off to start a completely unproven, highly dangerous new venture in an untested market with zero guarantee of return on investment, simply because they believe the global mission of the technology is more important than the quarterly earnings of their specific zip code. In a corporate boardroom, that is grounds for termination. You hoard your top talent. You build golden handcuffs to keep your stars in-house to protect your own institutional comfort.
Exactly. The human instinct is institutional self-preservation. But the manuscript calls Antioch's action fruitful disruption. Antioch actively chose to destabilize their own comfortable equilibrium.
Fruitful disruption.
They understood a profound truth about living systems. The ultimate health of a community is not measured merely by its internal growth or its seeding capacity, but by its sending capacity. They refused to protect their best assets out of a scarcity mindset. They realized that a massive vision requires alignment, and alignment requires sacrificial action. So they laid hands on them, prayed, and released them into the unknown.
They released them. They didn't cling to them.
Yeah.
It requires an incredible amount of institutional security to realize that the mission is larger than your logo. This brings us to a massive practical hurdle for the listener. Let's say you have processed all of this. You feel the holy discomfort. You understand the theology of the first mover. You are ready to stop waiting and start building.
You ready to go?
Yeah, but how do you actually mobilize the people around you? Because whether you are Nehemiah rebuilding a wall or a manager trying to overhaul a toxic corporate culture, you cannot execute the vision alone. How do you translate a private internal ache into a shared public movement?
This is where so many visionary leaders crash and burn. The manuscript addresses this by identifying the trap of the silent failure of unspoken vision.
Unspoken vision.
A leader can spend months praying, observing the data, and feeling the agonizing weight of the need. They have perfect internal clarity, Yet the organization remains entirely stagnant. Why? Because the leader has fallen victim to the curse of knowledge?
Assuming everyone knows what they know.
They assume that because the failure is so glaringly obvious to them because they can see the water flooding the hallway so clearly, it must be equally obvious to everyone else.
But everyone else isn't looking at the water. They're looking at their phones. They are consumed by their own localized anxieties, their own inboxes, their own daily survival.
Precisely. The text states unequivocally that a community does not mobilize simply because a leader possesses private clarity. A vision that remains locked inside the leader's head is effectively non-existent.
It doesn't exist.
To bridge the gap, the vision must be translated into human language. It must be articulated with profound moral weight. It has to be illustrated with narrative stories that bypass the analytical brain and strike the heart. And crucially, it must be deconstructed into concrete, immediate, actionable steps. If the vision isn't spoken out loud, repeatedly, it remains an isolated, eccentric insight rather than a unified direction.
But there is a specific type of communication the text warns against, which I found fascinating. It calls it sentimental vision. What is the danger of sentimental vision? It sounds like a positive thing.
Sentimental vision is incredibly deceptive because it mimics the aesthetics of true leadership. A sentimental vision is an articulation of a problem that sounds deeply poetic and inspiring. It resonates emotionally. A leader might give a speech about the marginalized or the brokenness of the system, and everyone in the room might be moved to tears. But the defining characteristic of sentimental vision is that it requires absolutely zero behavioral adjustment. It demands no structural obedience, no financial sacrifice, and no shift in daily habits.
It is the equivalent of watching a devastating 2-hour documentary about extreme global poverty while sitting comfortably on your couch. You feel a profound, sweeping sense of tragedy. You might even cry. You feel like a deeply empathetic, good person for having watched it. And then the credits roll and you just queue up the next comedy special. The emotion was a substitute for the action.
That is the perfect analogy. Sentimental vision allows a community to consume the aesthetic of caring without enduring the friction of actually serving. To combat this, the text argues that a leader must take fierce ownership of the narrative. They must publicly claim what others are only casually noticing.
Connect the emotion to the action.
And they must connect the emotional why to a very specific structural what. They cannot simply stand up and say, we need to be a more welcoming community. That is sentimental.
So what should they say?
They must say, people are walking into this building, sitting alone, and leaving without anyone learning their name. That is a theological failure. It is unacceptable. And starting next Sunday, here is the exact protocol we are implementing to change it.
Oh, that's incredibly specific.
And then they have to repeat that message ad nauseum. The manuscript emphasizes that repetition is not redundant. It is strategic. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity breeds psychological ownership, and ownership eventually yields participation.
You have to beat the drum until the rhythm becomes the subconscious heartbeat of the entire room. But let's introduce the friction that every single person listening is feeling right now, the terror of vulnerability. We hesitate, not because we don't know what to say, but because we fear the execution will be flawed. Why do we freeze at the starting line, waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect budget, the perfect unanimous consensus that we all know deep down is never going to arrive?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the hesitation is rooted in self-protection. The text points out a profound reality. As long as a massive initiative remains purely an idea in your head, it is safe.
It's perfect in theory.
In the realm of theory, your plan is flawless. It has zero critics. But the exact moment you take your first physical step, the moment you launch the prototype or call the meeting or start the program, you cross a threshold. You step out of the impregnable fortress of theoretical commentary and onto the battlefields of real, measurable responsibility.
And on that battlefield, you can be evaluated. You can be proven wrong. You can fail publicly. And you will absolutely be criticized by people who are sitting safely in the stands, who always prefer the comfort of caution over the messiness of courage. It is infinitely easier to be a critic than a creator.
100%.
The critic risks nothing but their breath. The creator risks their reputation, their energy, and their ego.
That is the paralyzing force. Leaders are haunted by the specter of a flawed first attempt. They convince themselves that they must wait for ideal conditions to emerge before they can be obedient to the burden. But the manuscript delivers a blunt, unavoidable truth. If you demand perfect conditions before you take action, your obedience will remain permanently postponed.
So what is the antidote? How do you bypass that neurological freeze response?
The text introduces one of its most liberating concepts, sanctified incompleteness.
Sanctified incompleteness, the idea that a thing can be holy or right or necessary, even while it is totally unfinished and messy. Unpack the mechanics of that.
It is the realization that your initial step of obedience does not need to resemble the final, polished, optimized shape of the vision. It simply needs to be a faithful movement in the right direction.
Just take the first step.
You do not need a flawlessly engineered architectural blueprint to pick up a trowel and lay the first brick. The text argues a point that completely flips. Our normal understanding of planning action is not the enemy of discernment. We often think we must discern perfectly before we act. The manuscript posits that action is actually the primary vehicle through which discernment matures.
You literally figure out the parameters of the problem by colliding with it. You launch the messy beta version of the software. You start the deeply imperfect, slightly awkward community group in your living room with only 3 people. You make the clumsy first phone call to the person you know is struggling.
Because that's where the data comes from.
Right. The friction of the action itself provides the data you need to refine the approach. You don't have to be a flawless expert. You just have to be a faithful initiator. This concept provides the perfect transition into our final major section. We are moving from the high-altitude theology and vision casting down into the granular, physical reality of what this initiative looks like on a random Tuesday. And the reality check for the listener is this true initiative rarely looks like a glamorous, stadium-filling, headline-generating campaign.
It almost never makes the news. The manuscript grounds its practical application in an ancient biblical principle from the book of Zechariah: do not despise the day of small things.
The day is small things.
Our culture is obsessed with scale. If a project doesn't go viral or scale globally or generate massive immediate metrics, we assume it's failing. But true, deeply rooted initiative almost always manifests as ordinary, relentless faithfulness.
Give us some of those unglamorous examples.
The text provides highly specific ones. It is the act of meticulously mapping out a welcome pathway so a terrified newcomer doesn't slip out the back door unseen. It is the patience required to start a small discipleship program for a handful of children. It is the quiet, time-consuming discipline of visiting the elderly who are slowly being erased by isolation. It is the long, frustrating process of mentoring young men who are drifting into apathy.
It is the profoundly unsexy work. It is the spreadsheets tracking who hasn't logged in or who hasn't shown up in a month. It is the quiet cups of coffee that don't get posted on social media. It is the granular mechanics of actually caring for human beings.
Yes, and the text uses a brilliant phrase to describe these small, granular acts. It calls them atmosphere builders. This is a critical sociological insight. When a leader, or even just a participant, moves first to address a quiet need without demanding a parade or waiting for optimal funding, it alters the neurological pathways of the entire organization.
It changes the air in the room.
It acts as a cultural proof of concept. It teaches the surrounding community that needs can actually be named, and more importantly, that they will be addressed. It shifts the entire environment from a posture of passive, critical observation to a posture of responsive, localized obedience.
It transitions the group from being an audience evaluating a performance on a stage into an active, interconnected, living organism. It builds an atmosphere where initiative becomes highly contagious. If I am sitting in the back row and I see you quietly step up and organize a meal train for the single mom who just lost her job, it shatters my own bystander paralysis.
It gives you permission.
It implicitly gives me permission and the courage to finally step up and mentor the struggling teenager I've been worried about. But there's a line in the text regarding this practical execution that absolutely stopped me in my tracks because it confronts a major bias in how we view organizations. The line is, "Structure is not the enemy of compassion."
That is perhaps the most paradigm-shifting sentence in the entire document.
Because especially in creative spaces, nonprofits, or spiritual communities, we have this ingrained rebellion against structure. We view administration, databases, and protocols as these cold, corporate, rigid constraints that crush the organic, spontaneous movement of the spirit or of genuine human connection. We romanticize the chaotic, fly-by-the-seat-of-your-pants approach to helping people, but the text frames structure as the actual vessel that allows love to survive.
The manuscript elaborates on that idea with a profound definition. Structure is compassion made sustainable. If you analyze that, the logic is undeniable. Imagine a leader who possesses a massive, agonizing burden for the homeless population in their city.
Okay.
They have the passion, they have the tears. But if they refuse to implement a structure, if they rely entirely on the daily adrenaline of their own empathy, it will simply burn out. Without a structured, systematic response, A heavy burden inevitably crushes the person carrying it.
You run out into the street, give away all your money, your coat, and your energy on Monday, and by Wednesday, you are completely emotionally bankrupt, cynical, and unable to help anyone ever again.
Exactly. The text uses the mundane example of a follow-up database for a church or a community center. To a purely visionary, highly emotional leader, entering names into a spreadsheet feels like soul-crushing administrative red tape. It feels unspiritual.
Very corporate.
But the manuscript argues that the database is actually a profound theological declaration. By building a system to ensure no one is forgotten, the community is declaring, in the physical realm, that strangers possess inherent dignity and should be integrated into a family. A structured scheduling plan for children's mentorship isn't just bureaucratic red tape. It is a structural prophecy that the next generation's spiritual survival matters enough to plan for it.
Structure gives a spiritual burden hands, feet, and a pulse. It transforms a private, fleeting emotional ache into a shared institutional reality that can operate long after the leader's initial surge of adrenaline has faded. Structure is compassion made sustainable. If you take absolutely nothing else away from this hour, write that phrase on a sticky note and put it on your monitor.
It's that important.
It completely redeems the concept of administration. It elevates the spreadsheet from a corporate tool to a scaffolding for human love. It means the person managing the logistics is doing work just as holy as the person delivering the visionary speech.
And that fusion, the deep internal burden paired with the sustainable external structure, is the exact blueprint for how a community transcends mere survival. That is how an organization stops reacting to the floods and begins building an entirely new architecture.
We have covered an immense landscape of thought today. Let's synthesize this journey for you listening, tying the philosophical threads back into a cohesive knot. We began by confronting the invisible trap of the maintenance organization, exploring how human beings naturally normalize dysfunction and learn to ignore the quiet absences in favor of blazing fires. We dissected the anatomy of a true missional burden, learning that we must move past the safe distance of sympathy and allow the holy discomfort to enter our bones, while carefully distinguishing that love-driven concern from the soul-narrowing grip of panic.
Right.
We explored the paradox of initiative, discovering that taking action is not an ego trip, but a surrendered response to the divine first mover, and that continuing to wait when the need is obvious is simply dressed-up hesitation. We looked at the radical, fruitful disruption of the Antioch model, proving that sometimes you must sacrifice your best assets to serve the larger mission. And finally, we learned the necessity of speaking the vision out loud, embracing the messy vulnerability of sanctified incompleteness, and utilizing structure to ensure our compassion doesn't end in burnout.
It is a comprehensive psychological and spiritual roadmap for shifting from passive observation to courageous, sustained engagement.
But before we officially sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to chew on. This builds on the themes we've explored, but pushes the implications directly into the neurology of your own daily life. The text asked a piercing diagnostic question: what has become normal that shouldn't be? But let's extrapolate that further. If we accept the premise that initiative is not a genetic trait, but a spiritual and cognitive muscle, a reflex that must be continuously engaged and exercised, what happens to the architecture of our minds when we stop flexing it?
That's a scary thought.
Does prolonged passivity, the act of sitting in the meeting week after week, watching the water rise in the hallway, and choosing to remain silent, does that repeated suppression of our instincts actually rewire our physical capacity for empathy? If seeing the unseen is a fundamental moral responsibility, as this manuscript argues, then we have to consider a terrifying possibility. Could the greatest, most existential threat to our future, whether that is the future of our families, our companies, or our societies, could it not be some active, catastrophic malice or a giant, dramatic disaster? Could the true threat simply be the slow, comfortable, highly rationalized, and utterly silent atrophy of our own attention?
If we continuously train our eyes to look past the small, quiet gaps in our communities, we will inevitably lose the ability to see the human beings who are actively falling through them.
The paralysis becomes permanent. So your assignment this week is simple, but it is not easy. Look closely at the environments you inhabit. Look at your office, your neighborhood, your family dynamics. Search for the quiet absences. Find the water pooling in the corner that everyone else has agreed to step over. Stop waiting for the designated authorities. Feel the holy discomfort. Grab the wrench. And deep dive